第一阶段，到底去什么3年的公共工具有关的，把现在的先把修，刚先把这个他们去给他们的那个人，他听他的新年主办话，他新年主嘛这个他们先把写的subject，顺便通过的话，新年主办的嘛这个他们点把的了，我有当，以前他这边打，我觉得先把写你能他这边的。토지의 다her와 이제의 다대가서 조사하시 다 토지의 고도 지체가 그래서 다 드링디 토지의 권이 맞도스네 쉐인스.
Please begin by cultivating the motivation and making your mind clear and sharp. The motivation to attain the supreme and most precious state of complete and perfect awakening for the benefit of all mother sentient beings who are as vast as space, as infinite space. And the Dharma that we're discussing and listening to tonight is where we left off from last week. So that's within from last session, which was within the Lamrim Chenmo, in the section on serenity or shamatha. And within that, there's the discussion about the actual the demarcation of accomplishing and not accomplishing. What is the marking point of having accomplished serenity. And within that section, there were 3 subdivisions: the actual section, then the signs for having attained attention, and then the section on addressing the doubts and addressing questions.
다 신내에 가서는 대사를 밑에 띵인 진스와 다 가서는 친구기 교연당 처비에 되는 와 미과 싸와 나와다 안내자 때문에 와다 와 심장기 대회 심비 띵인 진지시 근데 디마세 다 된다와디 가리래 이거 끼는데 되는 뭐 되는 중도 줘야라 써봐 와 나 제말라 다지 여바든다디 제마 주 되잖아 소바도 유주라 미 되잖아 소바도 중도 줘야 딘데 망보지 송이 딘데 송이 다 도바 다 딘데 와디 다 디가서 독주에 가릴래 왔으나 딘데 왜다 신내디 계주 딘데 요나 디 라몽아이 콘도 가릴래 세치와 찍당 신내들 안 남바람 미도 비 이시스네 송도 인도전에 남바람 미도 봤을 때 돈이도 비 따와라 지금 말해 어디 치와니 독주니 두스 말래 와레스 자다 도준이기 랜디라 다 알아봐기 다 개바다 인다지 딘데 가시기 된 지월 랜 로파 잡소와 가센디 람 nga kun도 강들에 쓴다지 기바침도 람그래 마세 되네 딘다와디 신장게 되네 룽레수룽알 때네 루레수룽알 때네 신장게 대외스마인상 드르와 조름게 되네 라메하레 스노타 딘데게 다 랜로파 장게 중소와 라랑룰라디 가스나 가릴 조림당 티바침람다 파시는 람자면 말해스 다 많이 비교제 가리래 쓴다는 디니 맞지 시자에 무슨 지금 고수 되는 제스.
And now in this section on addressing these various questions that arise. So then we have, what is the basic entity of the serenity? It's the state of concentration that is free of the laxity and excitement, those faults of laxity and excitement. It has those 2 aspects of the stable abiding, as well as the vivid clarity, the intense vivid clarity. And it's this special state that it has these, very profound characteristics where there's very few afflictions. The afflictions are reduced greatly. It has all those other signs, all those other those signs which were mentioned in the previous section. And so since it has these wonderful qualities, then you have some questions that that can arise regarding the state of serenity. So one of the questions is, well, if it's really this state which is, as we call it, non-conceptual or free of a non-conceptual state, then is it meditation on emptiness? So that's one question. And then the other question is, since it's this, great state with all these powerful qualities and reduction of the afflictions, isn't it a path itself, right? Does that mean that this shamatha, the serenity, is itself a path? So then there's various positions or different ideas that are presented by various earlier scholars and practitioners, but here J. Rinpoche is answering those two particular questions. And so the basic answers that he gives, and we'll go into more detail now into why he's answering this way, but the basic answer is that, for the question on the paths, is this a path? So some would say that it's a path of Mahayana, some say that it's because this state of serenity is imbued with this powerful bliss, this bliss that arises from the not serenity, the pliancy of body and pliancy of mind. And so because of that, they would assert that it's thus the completion stage of highest Dukkha Tantra. And so the J. Rinpoche is saying it's neither of those. Not only is it not a Mahayana path, not only is it not the completion stage of highest Dukkha Tantra, in fact, it's not a path at all.
Siba Tadaki Kyun Legatone, Koala Yijungi, Taba Tunigi, Yijungi, Sambesina, Tabilam to Dushings, or Chanjugi Simri Muji Sinani, Tibachim Lamduan Dudes. But that the Karisung Warsana, that in the Wadikasna, in the Shine, in the Veda Kasna, or Shinjagi Davis Simbe, what that Chingu Kyun and Tribute in the Shine, that Lamai between the Kasna, teaching that Timmy Lam Kaya Mare, Kasna, Tindawadi. China tomorrow, what Chirubi Tinekasna, Namsule, that Kasna, Komi W, Koranzu, the Komaki, Tablet, Nova Sanje began using the end of China Nigi tomorrow, so and so. Then Lamla do not have a that did using the Dian, Dami Chimalo, Tawadan, Siba Tadala, Kion, Legaton, Koala, Yichung, Tabatuni, you service not Tabet Lam to what is. Talams in the Kasna, Talams or what Talam. Talam said the Kasna Lamdla Kaleji, Cheju Changsna, Taji, Siba Tadala, Kule Batova, Snata Kuigi, Wata, Kova City, Tapachilo, Mebachani, Leda Numongi, Rome, Batinekasna, Chiegi, Tuanapa Nazo Chiegi, Tudang, Jabala, Dinua, or that Dunga Tada, or Anjugi, Dunga Tada, Dunga di Kichigi, you Leda Numu Tadale, Dine, Archina Chimaru, Sabita, Orusutuna. 아니 레다 뉴몽기 찡비 사지기 풀고 디케지기 두 오 딘데지를 존나 찌마루 삼바고 딘데기다 아 가르레 어나 디 초에 와 디다 레뉴기 제부다 제발레 초에 초와 타바 들리니비 오 딘데기로 찌마만 비심바이나 아니 탈람세디 신이 차와레스 와 탈람 람세디라와 인중비 삼베스미 온도 람비다 된디와 인두자니 아 딘데비 인중비 삼베심바 인중비 삼바디 신나 아니 람도 주와레스 다 디게지 시에데 인중의 삼베 심바 세기 인중의 컨디지라 삼로 땅거래 나와이나 다 디 인중의 삼바디 아니 게 된다 디시디지라 자기 있어
그나 가르네 로바인단다 도바체바니 네레레
알 가진 네가 빌려서 데 친한 이게 와 치바다 남반이기 띵인지 투모와 유노세 대인지 조사소와 가서 동바치에 되게 레인들라 레인드 조사소와 가진디
I think from the furthermore, little bit below furthermore.
아니 보이겠다요. 형 다음에 받친지 말로.
어디 다음에
546 fourth sentence.
546 man. Ngeta kadari.
나 가지디 도바치에 치와딜라와 신의 뭐 나오세체 디 호딜라더니 지 람파샤 와 팅밍이 람자메 마레스 다디 아니 와 친한이게 디니 직 투모이 람레 세지 와 치바다 남반이게 띵인지 투모와 히노 어디가 또 조사해 그래서 예서 오빠째바데 오즈라
Okay, when inji da ragire inji.
디양 다음에 봐 또 병원 따와서 세대
Ribe.
디니 말은
Okay, diyan da meba chinchi malo beta to beta what. Yeah. Let's. Okay, so here's the English. It is page 87 in the English. Furthermore, if this concentration is imbued with the view that correctly knows selflessness and with the attitude of the determination to be free, which properly ascertains the faults of the whole of cyclic existence, is repelled by the cycle of existence, and diligently strives for liberation, it turns into the path to liberation. So this is here, what we're saying is, so actually I should have started a little bit ahead of this. So just that first one sentence above. So therefore, non-Buddhist sages who by means of mundane paths free themselves from attachment to the level of nothingness and lower levels must proceed to higher paths on the basis of this concentration. So this is a concentration common to both non-Buddhists and Buddhists. So what we're saying, what Tsongkhapa is saying here is that the reason that this doesn't become a path, the attainment of serenity, is because it's common to both Buddhists and non-Buddhists. So it's a common realization or a common attainment. So it's not a path, because when we talk about a path, this in the context of the Buddha's teaching, we're talking about a path to liberation, or a liberation path, tarlam, a liberation path, a moksha marga. So this is really what is meant by path, and what is the more precise meaning of it. So as it says here, it's the attitude of the determination to be free, which properly ascertains the faults of the whole of cyclic existence. So this means you have the awareness, one has the awareness of all of the suffering of cyclic existence, the complete collection of the afflictions and the actions, which are the contaminated actions that arise from the afflictions, and seeing that whole collection of samsaric contaminated phenomena, and having the wish, the thought, I must be free from this state. I must be free from these contaminated phenomena. So this is the mind of the determination to be free. And here when it says, oh, okay, no, it doesn't say here, but the word we use is, what is the word? An uncontrived. So an uncontrived determination to be free, which means that it's, really kind of deeply felt, and it's this, you could say maybe the genuine determination to be free. So that's when someone has the understanding of really what liberation means, and what, kind of an unconfused, unerring understanding of liberation, then they can develop this determination to be free from cyclic existence. So any practice or, kind of virtuous mental state that's generated within that attitude, that's imbued with that attitude, then becomes a path of liberation, or quite, or just simply a path in this context. So that's what is meant by a path. Yes.
Lamrim Goni Machazan Shun Joina, that give to Katula, the Indian go to give shoot to entire. That the Lamrim Chazan, that Romanu, and that the answer to you want to do a pendo chip with the Matashi Shuwa. Use an Itang in Jungle Samba said, so Gula Darwa, Rani. I need to Sungi, what that to make it to me that you to make Chabaduchi to me said it's also with similar to Musum Lego. Couple Naza, you to make it to make it level, because 아니 소소기 풍고디 내가 뉴몽게 라완치비 풍고 임비치네 동해랑 신체 디딩도 양자드니 내 나살라 소베드니 아니 강에 퇴배요나 동해기 동해에 세딜레고 무조건 딘데 용거 아나 신갑에 교회 동에 신당 거랑 조배나 세 상부로 냠수님이 되는 초와 대화 세저와 답변하고 칼라서비 어때도 칼라시 무지선아 진난지 축지나 대화지 내고와 어디 인도 대화지 차고 말아 내가 그 대화도 있네요 그 세디 망불 세자스나 양 대화지 봐 주네 대화 매마 아나 신가랑수 아니 지 도로도 지네 도로 싸워지 그런데 정부 때지 근데 내년도 딘데지네요 그 제네 딘데 도로디라 봐 시바 tre도에 다나신 아니 직소소에 대해서 강바지네 강바 싸워지 나와 좀 남산 대년지게 딘데지네 규rum부주네 야 대화지 매봐 줘요 어다 두조 교육이 대화지 내기도 하고 어디 잡아두지 그래서 교육 동에서 딜레바 하고 중세지 대화 디니바 주도 체조로 와가랑도다 앞에나 가랑도 소소다 대화요 조로 과지 투와이나 당고 대화지요 때 코님도 대 지자수나 양 김만 매바지 차야죠로 와다 뒤서 교육 동에서 딘데지 강 이거 예양가랑도요 달 하도도 디니 잡아두지 동에서 내가 니모한게 라와메 발랑교게 디니 가랑도 아니 풍부지요 어디 깨지기지 주도 집에 질레기 어디 뒤 잡아두지 동에 어다 뒤 순간라 니미 톤이 다 된다와디 채널 뒤서 말해 땅을 직강에 적인 тө베레샤 삼이 채널 찌마루 삼이로 왔다 배 된다는 채로 채나 삼이 김제기 로직 뱅망기 깨발리나 아니 게 중사 맞죠 많이 봐스 다 뒤깨발라 가리고레스나 소수를 쓴다 류기 띵고 다 동에서도 모두 지도 하고 등에 대해서도 다 우유스네 좀 되게 등에 시합을 자 근데 최송인데 등에 대바데 두고 송에 다 뒤로 왕인 중 삼별 남기다 심하다고도 등에 모두 지야 돼요 근데 전에 다 마치 당신은 다 나라도 등에 모두 지는 심나라 강에 되베로 지수에게 되는 내고 때 오늘 지나 민중 삼발로 로장에 지나 등에 모두 지는 수수들이 등에 삼는 땅에 다 등에 되는 전에 찌마루 삼별로 등 남기고 그래서 뒤에도 다 등에 다 가지 내가 그 등에 많이 받지 아니 배지 소수가 다 유다 심니가라 캡이 등에 주당 제가 동아디 가는 용을 두 아니 내당 니모 얘기 꾸준당 아니 동아와 니모 꾸준히가 못좋지 달 꾸준당 등에 니가 못줘야 고지 제토와이나 아니 제나치 마로 선별로 등 남기 찍고 등 남기 찍으나 어떤 민중이 삼바스나 뒤에 어떤 뒤 내와이나 다 남기 소수가 뒤 나라 아니 가스나 띵인지 곰 간지지는 남라 차고 딘디지기 심바이나 아니 람라 차고레스 뉴스네 다 민중 세대 소수고 땡고 두면 나주 사발라 때네 존나 찌마루 삼바지 그면 타달래 와다 두면 당 민진이다 두면 민중이 삼모로디 삼모 야부 땅도나 아니 시행이 땡고 되네 두면 존나 찌마루 민지 삼모 땅에 내로 차고 뉴스네 민지당 민중이 아니 카팔로스로 인소 민중이 소수 땡고 두면 나주 삼면도 민중체 심지어 랑니를 심비 심지어 신기 동안 나주 삼나 민제스 들어와 아니 다 랑니 동안 나주 삼네 제나 찌마루 사바 망길렘나 아니 랑레 심비 심지어 동안다 전나 찌마루 삼비 민제 등 망기게디 아니 고 필요요 그래서 유산이 동안 나주 삼는데 빼나 빼지 샤네와 중앙지 나는 렘니 아니 쩨바디와 중앙지 나는 렘니 중앙기 나기 강연수 통주다 중앙지는 전나 직사 말해 삼bil 랑성 타로치나 섬섬로 기고로 깨지 가서나 중앙 농로기다 동에나 만나서 교연도 통연도 아니 지나 전화 섬불로 된 남기 기기도 어디 나시 전에 말한소이네 수수 생비된도 동에나 만나서 용거 된소 동에 타다 기기 주당 제발을 전화 찌마로 삼발라 대다 우주 지에디 아니 개침을 차대고 인상 동에 대마다 꾸준 대마디 담망시 저우지 인중이 섬비다 망시 저우 우주 지에디 어딘데 저우지 무슨 지고레스 어디 연나 되는 게 삼바 어다 디스 요사비델라 아니 배 소소기 줄라다 아나 그래 곰 간지지는 다 진짜 남도 작용을 해서 어떻게 신뢰해야지
So then explaining a little bit further what this uncontrived renunciation or determination to be free is about is it's where you so and then when we say that there's different kinds of this determination to be free because there's the uncontrived kind as well as a contrived kind. So then what does this mean? So the uncontrived kind of determination to be free first is what, to generate it is the practices that were explained and the contemplations that were explained during the section in the paths shared in common with beings of middling capacity in a former section of the Lamrim Chenmo. So for those who weren't present during that explanation, then later we could discuss that as well. But since we won't go into much detail now, but the basic presentation there is about suffering, the truth of suffering, or dukkha. So within the truth of suffering, there are three different varieties, three different understandings of suffering. So the first kind of suffering, the first variety of suffering, is things like sickness, illness, running into problems in your life, having these various sufferings of problems and pain and sickness. And so that's one kind of suffering. The second kind of suffering is the suffering of change. And so this variety of suffering actually is referring to when we have temporary or fleeting pleasant experiences. So for instance, you can eat some nice food, and then there is a short period, there's a temporary feeling of pleasure and happiness from that, but eventually that fades. The happiness, pleasure will fade. So you can think about other pleasurable experiences, getting new clothes. You get some new clothes that you like, and there's a nice feeling, a pleasant, enjoyable feeling of that from that. But that also doesn't last for a long time. It also fades and disappears. If you get a new house or a nice place to live, then at first you are excited and you have an experience of happiness being in the new place, and then eventually that also disappears and fades away. So those are all called the suffering of change, because there is some temporary feeling of pleasure, but it's not, it doesn't last long. It eventually turns into, or it fades, and again, suffering, it is replaced by suffering or fades into suffering. So then the final kind of suffering, the final variety, is really this is really the most essential kind, the one that we're really emphasizing in our contemplation, which is just the presence of the aggregates themselves, the 5 aggregates that are contaminated, called the contaminated appropriated aggregates. So these are constantly changing moment by moment. Their nature is to be unstable. And so we see how there's this complete, there's a deep problem just with being in this very state of having the afflictions and having these 5 contaminated aggregates. And so you see that everything within the cycle of existence is kind of tainted by these problems. And so seeing that, then you have the thought, the feeling that this is not okay. It's not okay if I am not free of this state. So that's the determination to be free. And when it is generated to a point where it just spontaneously arises, where it just naturally arises within you, then that's the uncontrived determination to be free. So that's the one that we're referring to here when we're talking about a path, or a path of liberation. So again, the Buddha himself, during his first teaching on the turning of the wheel, Dharma Sutra, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, said, know and understand suffering, or suffering, another way of translating that is simply, suffering is to be known. So here, this is exactly what we're talking about. It's getting familiar with, making an introduction to the suffering within your own mind. And it's this that is the process of generating the determination to be free. So you look within your own continuum of consciousness, your mental continuum, and you see those forms of suffering, those 3 forms of suffering within your own continuum. You see that the, afflictions and karma and afflictions are causing this, that they're causing this problem, and that's called the truth of origins, right? The second of the 4 noble truths. So you understand the first truth, and then you see how the second noble truth is involved as well, the truth of origins, and you have this strong sense, again, this spontaneous feeling that it's it's best if I'm free of this, or I must be free of this state. How excellent is it if I can be free of this state? So that's when you are generating renunciation. And if you think about, or the determination to be free, if you think about these things clearly and and you think about them thoroughly, then it's easy to generate compassion for others, because you have this thorough understanding of your own suffering. And then instead of thinking of it in terms of your own attainment of liberation, then you just turn your attention towards sentient beings other than yourself. And so then you are able to see their suffering and generate compassion. And again, you can very easily have this spontaneous, this naturally born feeling of compassion for others. And as an example for this, it's like if we walk into a prison and we see all of the prisoners that are there and locked behind bars, and we have this feeling, this sort of, it's easy to generate a feeling, it's not okay that they're locked up like this. They must be released from prison. And that's because you see all the difficulties they face, the problems, the faults, the problems of being in prison, all of the many difficulties that are involved with being in prison, the sufferings. And so you see all that. And so likewise, when we're generating renunciation, the determination to be free, we see within our own mind all of these problems. And so we see how much, all these problems within our own mind. And so we likewise generate this attitude of, this is not okay, the situation is not okay, we must be free from this situation. And so the actual thought of renunciation, the determination to be free, is like the basis for all the paths, as a basis for spiritual practice. So that's why once you have this uncontrived determination to be free, then when that's combined with, or when that imbues any other kind of meditation or any other kind of spiritual practice that you do, then they all become paths.
di masaya tanda di ani nginjungi sambe masimba ina kindibe shine dan haudong tumna yang ani karisna koa le chuwe tabi lam la manroa chine koa kiwi gyula chuwe ki kanzin lungjik tanda tanda lamri chimu nala yo marde lamri chungu nala tanda di shungdi lung changduwa nga yo nga tuyo sine da tanda chi lobe tanyang sa erwa tanga nambala ya chuyo ndi tini lobe pawo sine Lamrim aya dewa da zeba nangni wa ani jela tini korang tin da zeba lobe aya dewa lobe babala ki tin zeba ba lobe ki ba zeba zeni ani zeba pami tini lobe tayang korang da nangbala ya shuni tini be uma be jimnang juba chimuji chayo o kongi zamgyo bi tini wa temba chumdendela na teba chijo jo tibula karisungresna ngayo nga tuesa teba di mingla wa aji da teba mabu shuji peje mabu zamyo kongi wa tinda di 로벤 파워야 시그레 로벤 따양 스피 무딕바인데 치료바인 비가라 공기체라 따양체 남발아야 슈타디 아니 로벤 파워스 공기 니마다 치료바래 아고랑 치료바기 나까바디니 치료비가 슈 강가 쳬바 초도 좋아치 않으더니 남발아 쳬바 주니 날린절라와 로벤 아야 대와기더니 쳬바 전에 제가 퍼바와 공이니 제가 남발아 슈와와 슈니 다고랑 직 똠발아 대바기니 똠바선제 좀 내더라 똠바 그 슈 잠반나네 ngayo 되었으나 하리 송을스나 추기 쳐라 미초비 끼고 띠무 기동과 시제 버도 손에야 동의 양중 시버도 다 가리 송을스나 아니 템바 산지 주는데 제랑게 쳐라 그와 메겐게 아니 치료발라 소바 대사기 띠무 아니 와아 말이 듣고네 랑네 아니 시제 버도 되게 띵인진 곰 슈지 세토 잡여레스 와다 베나지 얘기 신의 곰 되는 하동 되는와 삼대기 내도 dwindo 되는 삼대 무시 시도 되는 수명 무시 시도는 시제보다 좋투고스 이나야 되는 고 꿀롱마에게 되는 타바 두니게 로이 마심바 인상 아니 로와 미시비 띠무 당진 와시 원도 손에 차다모스 와시 원도 손에 아니 가스나 타바 두니게 로이 마심바 인상 사토 띵인진 미바 토쇼 시제 무시 세보다 렘나야 마 냠니 아니 고 라이언들이 코아 계획 규차니 아니 그 코아 나라들이 배동안 나바 나소 용해지 용거를 쓰네요. 그 다양 코랑 영용 돈이 나가서 치료비 주는 나 가리고 그런 개발 전부 치료비 주는 아니 뒤뒤기 딘데 용어 딜 남라 때네 집어도 뭐도 더 도움도 되니 많이 냠니 코아 계획 줄라 두고도 나 가리셔왔으나 개우 띠무 기동 봤다 미시비 띠무 그 꾸는 랑네 차당 무슨 꾸는 랑네 탈바 두니게 인중 삼면 마신 바 인상 다야 띵인지 곰 슈토르네 치수 많이 냠니 아니 코아티 줄라 차고래 소다 인데 숨여래 인두산에 다 신에 디라 되네와 그런 곰기 답에 세토올렘나야 아니 꿀롱디드는 인중 삼면 마신 바이나 아니 답빌람마 만두 봤더니 코아티 줄 그랑라 아니 라양들이 예단이 모르게 라와메 비동안 때기 줄라파 두고래 소다 디미스 이제 시작을 보고
Kinla dana shine da something ki gomba that so kurang korla kewe gyu chagdo gebe chudong
그런 그런 게 꾸는데 이니 마심바 이모 당의 진짜 꾸는는 쳐다무슨 꾸는는다 신에다 하도야 공부하러 공부는 치수 얘기 가는데 됐다 오늘이나 그 대화 타도 때문에 양 동의 계획이 줄라 마찬이 라이언들이 코인네는데 봄 차선 냠니로 같은데 리고 아래스 어디 디스팅샤스 디로베 다양 게와 그게 보여주는
So now we have a quotation from a scholar who is named the Acharya Pawo or Acharya Taiyang. So he's also talking about this situation where even if you have attained serenity and even if you have insight also, vipassana, then it's not itself, without this determination to be free, it's not itself going to become a path to liberation. And what's the reason for this? We have a quote. It actually comes later in the text, a few pages down. So let me find the page again. So we are down in section, so it actually goes into the next chapter, but it is on page I'm sorry, I didn't mark it. Okay, here it is. Page 95. Page 95, and it's the indented verse. So this is how you can see it. So it says, here it calls him the Matchiseta. I'm not sure how to say that. I never anyway, the Tibetan word is Loben Bao. So actually Loben Bao is his name that he was called after he became a Buddhist, and Loben Taiyang is the name he was given when he was still a non-Buddhist, a practitioner of another religion. So this is a bit of sort of history that Genla stated, where this person, he actually, this master, he was a non-Buddhist practitioner of another religion first, and he was very keen on debating with a lot of the Buddhists, and he finally debated with the master Aryadeva, Aryadeva, and so he lost to Aryadeva. So afterwards, he was so moved by that experience, he started to study the Buddhist texts, and he became very he learned from them, and he became Buddhist, and he actually ended up attaining realizations and becoming a master himself. So he wrote this this text called Praise and Honor of One Worthy of Honor. So that's what the quote is from on page 95. So to read the quote: "Those opposed to your teaching are blinded by delusion. Even after venturing to the peak of cyclic existence, suffering occurs again, and cyclic existence is maintained. Those who follow your teaching, even if they do not achieve actual meditative stabilization, turn away from cyclic existence while under the steady gaze of the eyes of Mara." And so he wrote this praise. So what is it? What is he talking about here? He's so looking at the teachings of the Buddha and how those who are not involved in the teachings of the Buddha, again, this really refers to having, not having this determination to be free from cyclic existence. So then, so see, he's pointing out this, those are opposed to your teaching are blinded by delusion. So he's pointing out, he says delusion, but it's really referring to the three poisons of attachment, aversion, and delusion. And so these three poisons, if you do not have this determination to be free, these three poisons are going to be motivating whatever you do. So since these are involved with the motivation in your practice, even if you go, so he says, even after venturing to the peak of cyclic existence. So even if you go through all of these practices of generating serenity, generating insight, generating the four dhyanas or jhanas, generating the four formless absorptions, all the way up to the peak of cyclic existence, because the whole thing, the whole time you were motivated by afflictions, by delusion, attachment, aversion, and delusion, then you are still creating the cause to be reborn in cyclic existence that whole time. And so then you will fall back into cyclic existence. You will take birth again in cyclic existence. So it will not become a path to liberation. And so that's because you have this ignorance, this lack of knowledge about the, this lack of knowledge or this ignorance, which it was motivating your whole practice. So you need to have this desire, this aspiration to attain liberation for those meditation practices and those states of meditative stabilization to become actual causes for liberation. And otherwise, you are helpless and just under the control of karma and afflictions. So.
탈람도 교회들아 이중 삼바로 와다 지 탈바 돈얘기 이중 삼베스마지 고레스 소소와 아 틱바 침빌람나 좋아라더니 청주기 심리 무지스나 틱바 침빌람도 좋아해서다 이중 삼베스 심베 와더니 나 람이나 탈람도 교회이나 아 디딩도 와 이중 삼베스 심베딩도 아니 와 심제 탐지게 된도 조장통나 찌마로 냠비다 청주기 심리 무지여와 디기 심바이나 다 딘데베시니 신내디 아니 티바침빌람나 두고래 센두자니 지단 람비 맞zam게 티바침빌람나 두고와 말 티바침빌람나 두와라 예바도드니 청주 승기 심바지 고래 와 인두자니 다 신내기 어디 다 람마인장 콜라디니 니중 삼비 심바이나 탈람제 다 디딩도드니 청주기 승기 심바이나 아니 와 티바침빌람 다 청주 심 세디다 오르지 다 슈나 청주기 심 세디 지당 그네지스나 아직 이제 아니 규찬에 왔다 선제든지 동화다 전에 치마로 제와 딱이 좌우냐 쿠르키를 나서는다기 심비 땡네 아니 심제 탐지게 된도 아니 도배 산지 고방에 다다른 토바 책임 선배 디네로 쥐마 많이 받지라 청주기 심와 디기 심바이나 아니 택받침부 세우다 다 택받침부다 팀맘이 봤어다 인다 다 택받침부를 아마 로마로 세디 다 딘데베와 심제 탐지게 되도 조장네 배 간단한 토바 치고 냠비솔로 쥐마 많이 받지 심바이나 보다 딘데게 내가 개바디야 택받침부 개발아 주고 그래 심데야 택받침부 심 자고 인도전에 다 신에 대한 오늘 택받침부람도 주발해 소다 디samdi 송샤스
So what is the nature of a Mahayana path? If you ask what is a great vehicle path? So that's then on top of the determination to be free, you add on top of that the wish to benefit all all sentient beings and to become a Buddha for their benefit, which is the attitude of bodhicitta or the aspiration for full awakening. So that is from the starting point of renunciation, the determination to be free, then you have this determination to attain full awakening for the welfare of all beings, all sentient beings. And so that then becomes a Mahayana path, or those practices you do within that motivation become a Mahayana path. And this is, so what do we have then when we look at these kind of different possibilities of scenario when it comes to serenity? So we have the actual nature, the basic essence of serenity itself is not a path. Serenity itself is not a path. Then we have, when you are practicing serenity or attain, when the serenity which is imbued with this determination to be free is a path to liberation. Then on top of that, when you have the bodhicitta, the desire to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all other sentient beings, then that serenity becomes a Mahayana path. So it depends on, okay, so that's how that is. And so again, this attitude of bodhicitta is where you're really seeing, all sentient beings are suffering. And so, it's not okay that they're suffering. How excellent would it be if they're free from suffering? I will free them from suffering. I'm going to free them from suffering right now. So it's that powerful attitude that thinks in that way. Then whenever you have that attitude present, the meditations you do are all Mahayana paths. The virtue you accumulate is Mahayana virtue. So everything becomes part of the Mahayana.
어두체 다디누마 롱다 호들라 맨나 튠조라 센차 직대위 진바당지 수림나지 송화양 삼바 대다기 쓰나 진바다 타바당 탐제 kimbe 람기 소수 두와다 다우 스타간 송월스는 나도 신예당 다 하동들이 고마든도 뒤다기 강나 시와나시 맨나 하르스는 다 튠조를 와변의 치자우지 나가나도 배 칼라직 배인데 직 내직 칼라배 그러나 더 당연신 거지 제가 인제지기 진바장 아니 가랑주고 배 춘림나지 송와스는 답변나 춘림 가랑주고 담 이게 지금 이게 춘림송에 나게 춘림송에 이게 춘림송에 여러와 어배나 춘림나지 쓰는 배나 가랑주 속주고 뽕와리 나다 속균이 지금 신제 근데지기 송에는 지금 섬이 된적이 송승기 춘림나지 된데 이제 송와 인제를 들라양 그 그런 자와의 중중지 데리다면 같이 뭐 맞지 말데 kulungdidini nijungi sambe simaina ani talam gisibida chola wata an lamgi chosu juwa o diladini changjugi singi simaina ani tekbachim bichesu juwa o dinjegi da kebar chimu juwa re pe dinangshijini shine dilayang dinjere soda dilayangde tangarang dubena gomji jawaina yang gomji jabdu ani wala dini jamjugi simaina 망비 취해서 좋아. 와 점도 있었어. 점도 있었는데 아니 딜라디니 심지기 와다 정주 심기 삼보당 와이나 디바친 취해라 좋아. 오다 디다 간다 꾸노들라 알기도 와. 오 인두산이 다딘 마신제 인두산이 신에들라 진지기 에디니 신제 민중당 정주 심기 심바이나 탈빌람당 디바친 빌람 오 담지 김바토 빌람 두레 오다 딘데 마심바이나 이 우마레 빼나 디나시레 스노다
So we're going back up to the part of the text where it started in the class today. So that was 80. One second. I went too far. 1 second. Okay. So okay, therefore, okay. The generosity. So this is back to the middle paragraph on page 87, the second paragraph. Furthermore, so we read that part. And so just that next line, it says, for example, if the generosity of giving a single morsel of food to an animal and observing even one type of ethical discipline are imbued with these attitudes, they turn into the collection of merit on the paths to liberation and omniscience, respectively. Nevertheless, in the case of this question, okay, so yeah, that was all again I read. So this is saying how it's another way of saying what we were saying before, that when you have this kind of practice of serenity or even insight, then what kind of path it becomes depends on what it's paired with, what kind of motivation it's paired with. So a simple example is if you are giving food to a small animal, there's some animal, and even if you just give a small amount of food, that act of generosity, or likewise, if you have the practice of ethical discipline. So this would be ethical conduct would be like the ethical conduct of body, speech, and mind. So for example, the practice or the conduct of refraining from taking life, refraining from killing. So even those kinds of actions which we would be considered small or kind of basic small actions, if it is something which is paired with the aspiration or determination to be free from cyclic existence, then it becomes a path to liberation. If those actions are paired with the mind aspiring to full awakening, the bodhicitta, then they become Mahayana paths. They become the paths of the great vehicle. So the point that is being made here is that, so then also likewise, we have just the simple practice of, the basic practice of going for refuge. And so if you have the mind of refuge in the 3 jewels, and you pair that with whether it's one of these kinds of actions of generosity, ethical conduct, or the serenity practice itself, those things all become Buddhist practices, right? So they become Buddhist practices when you have the attitude of refuge. When you have renunciation, they become paths to liberation. And when you have bodhicitta, they become Mahayana paths. So what that's saying is that all of these, what the serenity, what kind of path the serenity becomes depends upon the motivation. So it always depends upon the motivation in the mind.
어두시 다 디오들라 연장 디니 람신 시기 심비권에 터바다 탐제 김비 람도 좀 줘봐 민지스 띵인진데 랑기 무이권에 람 칸도 줘봐 이노스다 다든다 디갑수다 든다 독주 당부디 가서나 신에 디니 람레 말에 람하고 강도 그늘에서 어떻게 지시해디 신의 거랑 우유천에 아니 람레 말했으니 제바디 제바레스 우리는 신의 랑기 우유천에 있는 람 말했어 와 대바 치중 관계자 람 말했어 와 많이 받이 가서나 다 탈람 심발라 미주삼비 심비도 미주삼비 심비 네바민도 가서나 띵에 중 아니 삼에 마심비 통이 미팅인지 공개했으나 된데 치료비다 띵인지 토올레게 무슨 된데 고마 요래스 다 탐지 쳔바기 저기 줄라야 만두와 전주스님 말씀을 내고 해서 유전에 다 신의 코랑 무유찬이 아니 남 인다 미기 제바디 돈이 남 말에 쓰는다 뒤에 지시해 했습니다. 엄마도 지기 코랑 신지기 고니 아니 남도 교와 요래 쓰다 신의 딜라와 아니 신제디니 가리데 미중의 삼비 심바이나 탈비 남나 교와당 전주스님 심바이나 탐지 쳔바도 남나 교회기 딘제기 신지기 고니 에스티안와 코랑 무유찬이나 아니 가스나 람 당신은 내고 말이 가스나 신의 토바tam기 아니 탈바트니기로 이 말씀 받더니 라야 신의 만 냠니 아니 계속을 깨게 되는데 내가 차기도 와서 인도산에 우리 진짜 제바 당부디 도주 당부디 람랑기 무유찬에 신의 랑기 무유찬에 람하고 그거를 가리래 서도 토바디 쪄바래 어디서
So then just to read the next sentence, which summarizes this first question and the analysis of the question. Nevertheless, in the case of this question, you do not investigate whether it becomes a path of liberation and omniscience in terms of its being imbued with other paths. Rather, you investigate which path it becomes by the very nature of the concentration itself. So I just will say, kind of as my own reading of the English translation here, it sort of confuses the question, but as where Genla's explaining it, I think it should be clear that it's saying that, in the case of this question, you do not investigate whether it becomes a path of liberation and omniscience in terms of its being imbued with other paths. So it's just saying that the basic, when you have the question, what is serenity itself? That question, if you're asking that question, to answer that, then you look at just the serenity itself, not what happens when it's paired with various different motivations. So when you just look at the basic attainment, the basic state of serenity itself, then it is not a path at all. So that's the answer to the first question, right? Which of the question again was, which of the 5 paths is Again, that's the path of accumulation, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, the path of no more learning. So which of those 5 paths is serenity? The answer is none of them, because by its own nature, it is not a path at all. Yet it becomes a path if it's paired with this attitude of renunciation, the determination to be free. It becomes a path to liberation, and it becomes a path to attaining the omniscient state when it's paired with bodhicitta, and it becomes it does become a path depending on the motivation that it's paired together with. So that's why it cannot be a path, because without one of these kinds of either of those 2 motivations, the renunciation or bodhicitta, one can still attain serenity, and one will attain the serenity, but without one of those 2 motivations, then eventually the serenity will degenerate, their state will degenerate, and they will once again return to an ordinary samsaric birth, and they will lose that attainment of serenity. So that's why serenity itself is not considered a path. That's
도체 다 디오들라 우마바당 심장바 양스 하동기 따위유 지터 때라 배발라 미티바 여장 지리시라 경외진 당스 대다게 똑바 줄라 기로 지라 미티만에도 다 가르쳐 걸스나 다 된다 디가나 롱망부지 파파 통역이 다 장사당 군주당 주주망부 장에도 주주 아니 유디 심장이 슝로 와디와 아 이나양 다 된다 우마비 된다 디 지시제 된다 디가 그 우마비 신다 루시제신 중국어로 근데 전에 되게 다 저기 세시도 된 거다. 가르스나 다 심장바당 우마바니라 아니 배 신내다 하동 오요찬네와 아니 공주당 되는 오 샤당당 두절라 미다와 개바개요 말레스 아 미든바 가르스나 신내다 하동이 유 따와줘와 따와 달 하동 유드니 유도 주고 돈이 때라 받단데라 심점의 샤당이 돈이당 우마베 샤당이 돈이 따와디 미다와 마도 지기 디 공경기 띵인지 신내달 하동라 민다와 매상 아니 지 디다디 신내달 하동 무징기 계시 시인도 아니 다 바바 통맥이다 슝도마 양스 장고 주제디 어다 진저라고지 돈이 이수고 디비자네 다 가르송 걸스나 지당 다 심자마당 우마바스디 답은 베나지 롭지 제시전의 지기 우마바스디 가스나 덴바 주비 취 뒤점에 매바 아니 자직이 남샤 대바 켈링엔들라 우마바체와 심장바스나 아니 시와 용주 덴바 주바레스 군다 덴바 마주바레스 어디르기 차치네와 데디니 켈링에 데니 주다모 가사들라 심장바스 이두선다 심장바당 우마바기 아니 켈렌디아 미다와 인상 디기 따와들라 미다와리고 이네야 따와디 공격이 하동라 아니 심장비 값을 지시 잡당당 아니 우마비 값을 지시 잡당기 하동라 하동 공당 지치라니 미티마 요 말해서다 이 뜻이 되기도 있어.
그나 연계 지당 우마에 따와서 그래서 우마베 룩스나 덴주 samyang came lembe
신이 수미와 시왕 요도 덴바 마주 시왕다 요도 군다 순가 덴바 마주바래 스미와 최담지 덴바 마주바래 덴바 주에 뒤점에 매 스미 자직이 넘샤 제가 켈링이나 우마바 저와치기랬어 덴바 마주
덴바 마주 자직이 넘샤 덴바 마주
로와치 최담지 덴바 마주바 띵네 저와치고래 스미 켈링바이나 우마바 아 시왕 요도 덴바 주바래 덴바 마주바래 라미나
let's see. Oh yeah. So then just reading one more line here. Further, so we're down to the next paragraph. Although there are inconsistencies between the Madhyamaka and Chittamatrin ways of establishing the object of the view of insight, in general, there are no inconsistencies in their identifications of serenity and insight, or in the way they develop knowledge of these in their mind streams. Therefore, the noble Asanga. So that's really just that one line was read. And so what this really is what the sentence is written for the purpose of is to kind of address another possible doubt, which wasn't explicitly raised, but is, all throughout this whole section on serenity, there are lots and lots of quotations coming from the text of Asanga, Arya Asanga. And so Arya Asanga himself is someone a proponent of the Chittamatra view. So he is a Chittamatra practitioner or teacher. Yet at the same time, the text of the Lamrim Chenmo, or the Tsongkhapa's basis for his own view, is the Madhyamika system, right? The Madhyamika philosophical school. So then, is there an issue there? That's sort of the underlying question here. And so he's answering it without really asking the question. So the answer is that yes, even though their views do have a different way of identifying what the object of meditation is and how to establish, what does it say here? Establishing, yes. So the different ways of establishing the object of the view, meaning emptiness, different positions on what emptiness means and how to arrive at the understanding of emptiness. The practices of serenity and insight have no difference. So the practices of the process of attaining serenity and insight, as well as the basic identification of what is the essence of serenity, what is the essence of insight, there's no difference between the Madhyamika and Chittamatra schools in that regard. So the quotations from Asanga are still relevant, are completely relevant here. And so just to give a brief explanation of what those views are of the Madhyamika and the Chittamatra. So just a very rough or brief way of stating it is that the Madhyamikas are those who accept that there's no no phenomenon is truly established. No phenomenon truly exists, not even as an atom. And the features of actions and agents are all not truly established. And likewise, we find sort of these terms maybe new to some people, but the I don't even recall exactly the English terms here. 1 second. So the Madhyamikas would accept that the other dependent natures, so there's 3 natures that are discussed in Buddhist philosophy: the other dependent nature, the completely perfected nature, and the does anyone else remember the other one, the English for the I can look in the dictionary real quick, but it's Kuntak in Tibetan. If no one, I'll just get it in a second. I can find it easily, I think. Sorry, because it's not actually in the Lamrim text itself, but Genla mentioned it, right? So I'll just say what they are. Zenisum, okay. Oh, but it doesn't have the English.
Thoroughly established, maybe?
That was the one I said. Oh, the imputational character. Okay, so the other powered, yeah, I don't think I actually used the correct term for that one though. So thank you so much. So it's the other powered character, or I'll say nature, the other powered nature, the imputational nature, and the thoroughly established nature. So those 3 for a Madhyamika are all not truly established, not truly existent. For the Chittamatra practitioners, they assert that the Chittamatra philosophers assert that the both the other dependent nature and the thoroughly established nature are truly existent, and it's only the imputational nature which is not truly existent.
어두신 다든다 디라 현재 드신데 걸자고나 인다디 우마바다 심sam바니게와 하동기 따위 유디라 미팅바 유에다라와 다 미팅바 간데 샤워레스나 다 동니 샤당디와 심sam베급도 동니 샤당당 우마비 동니 샤당다 수수니 샤투하고 심sam베급 동니디 간데지 샤워레스나 다 로투바 슈바이나 아니 치료 등기 동와 와 치료 등기 동와 빼나 간데 수라 자와이나 수당 수디 랑진 세말레 제신기 동화래 소다 동화디 어디 동화디라 동니기 되네 동관이 세팅되지 간에 다 지시 잡고 심sam베 우마베다 딜레 하바와 다 가리됐으나 아니 취어담지 덴바 주비 동화 와 된다빈 우마 탄주 바이나 아니 좀와 취어담지 되네 따든지 니에 요마레스 와 아니 랑싱 주바 뒤점에 내와 랑싱이 주비 동암 덴바 주비 동와스디다 똑베 파다섬 레마도 지기 따든지는 얘기 취지 요 말이 스디 따위 고관인이 되라고 동니기 따와 거랑 가르쳐었으나 아니 가르래 랑싱이 주바스나 따 가르래 따든지는 얘기 좀 해봐 따든지는 얘기 좀 해봐디 왔다 랑싱이 주바 동와티라 아니 동니기 따위 넘자 지고 왔다 디심점에다 디 갈라왔다 디 텔라 파투와 말아 인도전에 심점에 따위 동니당 우마비 따위 동니니 베트코랑 베차라기 개발요선 달 하동기 되는 유도주 따와니다 개발요 따와니디 다 동니기 샤당니다 와요선 디원도 좀 수고레스
So just to reiterate and make a little more clear, what's that difference that we're talking about again? It's the difference in the object of the insight meditation, the difference in the object of the vipassana. So this again is referring to emptiness. So the difference in the understanding of emptiness is where you draw a line between this Chittamatra and Madhyamaka. So with the Madhyamaka, then, first the Chittamatra, their understanding of emptiness is emptiness of external objects, or emptiness, you could say, of external reality. So it's the, for instance, forms and the minds which are apprehending forms being empty of having a distinct nature, being empty of having a distinct character. That's the emptiness as accepted by the Chittamatra. This is also the mind-only school. Sorry, I didn't mention the English term, the mind-only school. So then the Madhyamaka, or the middle way school, is their position on emptiness, or understanding of emptiness, is emptiness of true establishment of all phenomena. Emptiness of true establishment or true existence of all phenomena. And so what this means is the an object which is, or objects as they are, the designated or imputed objects, when one goes to search for the object which is imputed or designated by name, then there's no finding of that object. So the only thing left is that the phenomena exist by being merely, outwardly designated, merely, designated as something over there. But when you go to look for the thing that's designated, you don't find anything. And this non-finding, the inability to find a designated object, is the emptiness that is accepted by the Madhyamaka. So the Chittamatra are not, they're not able to get to that subtlety of analysis. So they don't have that way of establishing emptiness. They don't have that way of coming to understand emptiness. So there is a difference in the subtlety or the profundity of those two views.
어두시다 디오라 테나 바바 토메기 진사당 텔라 아바 두와당 꿀레 두바당 년도기 산남수 시내당 하동 소설 제비 너네스 시내 두바나 심그림바 두바 송시스 대한 년도기 살 개바 텔라 바바 이베스 띵인진 대다 하동 두루스 미셰체 중 대다 하동 심굴레 로스 시지 티 두루장 예사 수도 시비치로 대신도 우미 공문 남당 시진 맹아당 심구 신에게 남당 하동의 남도 수도 송라스 참와 참주네 송반 남장 통맥이 자와를 로나 네베스 신다 친구 탐지 딜라 공과직도 나오다 가르송거스나 다 신에당 하동 국주 된다로와 디나라와 답변다 파고 통맥이 송변은 장사당 아니 두와당 디네 나된 규조당 다 나신 디네 어디 나라들이 가서 신내당 하동 두부와 신내 두부 심내 탑 구고는 신내 두부 딜 로스들이 하동 두부 요와지 아니 숨바디 아니 우마비캅소야 디다 춤바 찍바 지장레스 와 다나신 아니 가리레 잠주스는 지주 전바 공격이 다 가리 도디제다 우단의 순순이 나신 바바 통맥이 짜비 아니 신내당 하동 두부들라 아니 심배지 우마바당 심점이 신다 친구다 아 개바 친구도 좋더니 미투바 요 말해 서다 신의 아동도 두들라와 인도전에 팀에서다 된다데 지름지 막 룬당도 신의 두당당 하든 신의 두당에는 뭐 룬당도 장사당 꾸규당 대균도 양양도 룬당원데 다 우주다 장사다 누가 심점이 된저르데 이나한테 우미값을 룬당에 대가서나 우마바다 심점이 개바든 졸라 신의 두당당 하동 두당라더니 민가왜 아니 지 요 말에 심점이 신의 두두 신의 탑 군고는 신의 두두 셔바나시 우미값이야 신의 탑 군고는 신의 두두 다가랑래 아니 하동 두두야 다가랑시 와다 디체인데 아니 다 다기 공부듯이 잡수와 신의 달 하동이라 민가와 요 말에 이게 유 따와들라 민가와 요래 세나시 진짜 인상 다 디진의 동도 가리 잡았으나 나 파파 도명이 흉망부 웅장인데 파파 도명이 심점이 신다 수지지 파파 도명이 되죠 심점이 된지 뭐부지 되 우미값을 웅장에 되가와 요 말에서 내가 되가서는 가서는 직접 봐도 주비차라 제반미 따위차라 미라와 유 따와 돈이 때라 파변데 미라와 레고라마도 지 주발 남기 준바 시엔데 제시자다 지바 인상 아니 군진 두순 장와래 심유전에 아니 신다치 못함지 공부치 군낭 소 제시 드리스 소샤스
Continuing on in the text, moreover, okay, one line above there. Therefore, the noble Asanga states in his Bodhisattva levels, compendium of determinations, compendium of knowledge, and Shravaka levels, that within the context of the individual practices of serenity and insight, when serenity is accomplished, it is accomplished through the stages of the 9 mental states. Moreover, since this is elaborately set forth in the Shravaka levels, these 9 concentrations are not asserted as the means for accomplishing insight. In those treatises, insight is explained separately from the 9 mental states, and the means of accomplishing it are also explained separately in Asanga's Shravaka levels. Similarly, the Madhyamika stages of meditation texts and Ratnakara Shanti's instructions for the perfection of wisdom also separately discuss the path of serenity, consisting of 9 mental states and the path of insight. There are also no discrepancies between the statements and the teachings of Maitreya and the commentaries by Asanga, so all the great trailblazers are of one mind in this regard. So this is reiterating that point once again more strongly by referring to the specific text about how the attainment of serenity is taught and practiced, and it is, it's so the basic point here, it's the same in the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika, the mind only and the middle way school. So you have many of these texts by Asanga, the Shravaka levels, the Bodhisattva levels, compendium of determinations, compendium of knowledge. So those are all texts by the master Asanga, and there's the discussion of the 9 attaining serenity through the 9 states. And likewise, you have the Madhyamika text, the stages of meditation, which are by, I don't think it says the author's name right here, those are by Kamalashila, and then Ratnakara Shanti's text, instructions for the perfection of wisdom. Those also explain the same 9 stages, or the 9 states of meditation, of serenity. So there's nothing that's in disharmony between these 2 schools of philosophy in terms of the practice of serenity and even the basic, the basic way to attain insight. However, the view that is meditated upon with insight meditation is different. That's the difference. That's where there is disharmony or non-concordance between them. Likewise, there's the text of Maitreya as well. Those also are in accord. For instance, the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, the ornament of Mahayana Sutras, those also were quoted above, and his texts, and they're all in accordance with each other. So all these quotes that come that were, many times were these source texts were quoted in this above sections in serenity, is showing that the Madhyamika and the Chittamatra practices of serenity are in complete accord, and there's no place where they are in discord with each other. So these are the the great, called the great trailblazers. So these are, especially Asanga and Maitreya referred to as especially Asanga, I should say, is referred to as a great trailblazer. And so even so then what the kind of this point comes to is that the practices of the how do you say it? Not method, but there's another word we can use, maybe the conduct, I guess. Yeah, the conduct of practicing the paths is the same, even though the view is different. So the conduct is the same with the the Madhyamaka and the Chittamatra, while the view is different. So
두시는 다 된다 디가도라 제시직다 쳔고에 대 가르쳤으나 지나서 다 된다 디 내게 람기 가도게 시행데 아니 가르 틱바침부 람 많이 봐 마세 팀이 람에 마인데 세가서 틱바치 중게 직시해요 다 디가서 된다 디 심잠바다 오마베케지 시행데와 아니 따와기 돈이케지 시행데 다양 디가서 틱바침부 세 제시자도 찍리고 인도전에 다 이 남준이 거나 다 슈마도 다 디니마 산인데 차로 와 제시 망도디 베 띵사부사부 다 디니마 돈이 코르시엔데 다 디치엔데 다 나랑 저게 된다 디 심자마다 우마바드라 티징기 두다 마와시 와 치라마와다 도데바니라 이네 팀밍이 두다 마와스니 티징다 팀에 랍단 지당 양 인도당 랑제기 람디라 아니 팀밍이 람세지다 청주선배 람디라 디네 티징바 친구 와야지 다 인도 대화다 대화심부터 깨지지 내고라 다 뒤쳐버디 대지지 예와 제마도나 다 투는 거 삼모마도스나 논이 들어서서 우리전에 다 인도당 랑제 대진 숨께지 시행도 람기 찬내와 다 지 가지래 청주 심기 마심바와 니중 삼바 지구 심비고네 아니 람라야 장원도 인도당 랑제 람디 내고 다 니중 삼배 심바 마세 디데도 청주 심기 심비고네 람냠네 징지나 아니 디바 친구 람세조 디 아니 갈스나 청주 심기다 딘디기 삼바 자친구 유명이고 내샤고 다 제다마와당 도대바드라 팀이 주다마와당 심자마도 오마바니라 기짐 주다마와세디 양 디고네 샤고 봐 이게 양스나 양디 추기 당매당 강사 당매 니가 따와 때라 베비체네 디바 친구 주다 다 심자마도 오마바니가 아니 가리래 강사기 당매기 따와대 드시자고 추기 당매 따와대 드시자니 캐된 거 우리 전에 디바 친구 세게 또 따와디 전에 시기도 다 년도다 안다디 가지래 제라마와당 도대비가서 강사 남의 투무자마도 지금 추기 남에게 드시게 되고 우리 전에 팀맥이 다 마와서 어디 우리 전에 다 두달라 뛰비 택바 지중세지 당 람라 뛰비 택바 지중세죠 다디 디 야와 두스니 쳇투나 아니 마슈마고도 고아마 주기 제가 요래서
So there's one point that we have to make clear here before we move on further in the text, because there is going to be an ever-increasing subtlety and profundity in the explanation that comes along as we move into the the later parts of the text. And this, what we're talking about here is when we had this discussion about serenity not being a Mahayana path, and not only that, it's not even a path at all, or it's not even a fundamental vehicle path at all. So here we have these terms come up of Mahayana, Hinayana, or great vehicle, fundamental vehicle. And so what are we talking about exactly here? So let's spend a minute to make an important distinction. If you don't understand this distinction, then it's going to be very easy to get tripped up and confused later on. So there's 4 different philosophical schools, or we could call them even different paradigms. The Tibetan word is jumta, if you're familiar with that term. So these 4 different paradigms where within Buddhism, within Buddhist teachings, there's Madhyamaka, Chittamatra, Sautantrika, and Vaibhashika. So those are in English the middle way school, the mind only school, the sutra school, and then the particularists, or yeah, that's what it's called. So these 4 schools are divided into Mahayana, and I'll just use the word Hinayana for ease. Okay, Mahayana and Hinayana. And so then you also have an explanation of Mahayana and Hinayana in terms of different types of practitioners. So there's the hearers, solitary realizers, and then the bodhisattvas. So the hearers and solitary realizers are Hinayana practitioners, whereas the bodhisattvas are Mahayana practitioners. So what's the distinction here? So when we talk about the four paradigms, the Madhyamika and Chittamatra are Mahayana philosophical schools, whereas the Vaibhashika and Sautantrika are Hinayana philosophical schools. So that description is being made, is rendered on the basis of the view that they propose, that the theories they hold. And so the Mahayana paradigms, the Mahayana philosophical schools, are those which assert selflessness of persons as well as selflessness of phenomena. So they have to assert selflessness of persons and selflessness of phenomena. If they assert both of those, they are a Mahayana philosophical school. Those schools, so that's the two of Madhyamika Chittamatra, those schools that assert only the selflessness of persons, the subtle selflessness of persons, and not the selflessness of phenomena, are the Hinayana philosophical schools. So that's the Vaibhashika and Sautantrika, right? Then when you come to the explanation about the hearers, solitary realizers, and bodhisattvas being either Hinayana or Mahayana, that's because the bodhisattva, the hearers and solitary realizers, their paths, their meditations are not paired together with the bodhicitta, the mind aspiring for awakening. Whereas for the bodhisattvas, that's why they're Hinayana. Whereas for the bodhisattvas, in addition to having renunciation, on top of the renunciation, they also have the attitude of bodhicitta, the mind aspiring for full awakening. So that's why they are Mahayana practitioners. So that here, it's not, the distinction here is made based on the broadness of the attitude or the motivation of the practitioner.
Oh yeah, that in my that the DNG that Chiwa Tongi Lengi Nongi, those are that in my Chiwa Niwa go to the war, within that they looked into the Shagi, that Chiwa Chile, not to the cheese.
So that was completed the discussion about the first question which arises in this section, and then we have remaining still the second question, but we're going to leave the class here for today and continue with that next week, so we can do a question and answer if people have questions. So I actually have my own question just based on the discussion that arose, or the explanation, which is, so if we talk about the the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika having the same practice of serenity and just a difference in their, understanding of the object of insight meditation, what about those other two schools that were just mentioned, the Vaibhashika and Sautantrika? So, tanda uzam nigi shine drupsol keper mes sena ani yugi gone keper mato shine drupsol keper mes serena dene do deba dong jedamawa nigi shine drupsol yang chiparebes.
Or to change the decapsu, so the umekapsu, that sends them long down, they send them down. Umabani, she to Pula, the Kaba Yomares and Geshe Jamdam, sends them Shung to Hung Dawa. Chidan, she is Chiramo, Dodo, Chiruba down, Chibajijan, Simne Tap Gubo, Simne Tap Gubo, Penis and Chinita, who mean Tadan Warima to come down the Taran, Chiwata Gubati Mam, Chiwetu, Chiminibo, and a Karukungu, Chimbinibo, the or Chingu, the Chimbata, Shishi, Madina, Rosayoma. Usaneta Gumla Simnipala Seji to never Chabala, any Ardu Churing, Chiwata Gubati, Nimutin, Tejerwa, that didn't Nimutin down Gumnati, that Arrange, Chibata Shishi top 10 10, and it's same now to Dunin, Jiba, Shuni, Mas Namin Chip Trade, the Kaya down, Simnipala, Neja Tembusue, or Nipa Sanante, 다 디니니기 다 랑가 도단디 아니 지금 지장 다 제라마단 그 시간을 민다가 요 말이스 그냥 디가서 샘점마다 우마라고 디시디 가서 도발리고 하러 우마베게 나디 기부 침비가도 우마베고 시행도 샘점을 우마무지 장어요 봐 유전이 가리나 삼이 비도 좀 팀바 요 말이스 샘점도 슝 아바 동네 슝도 시샤하시는 맛도 시작이었음 이승고로 와 지당 지발에 제라마도 되고 마스 치료바이네 다라리 되게 투모인 일어서서 띵인지디 지나 치바도 노반이가 투모인 됐어 이 람마레스 어디 다 도당디 찍어지지 징화다 그바디마 까기 줘야 돼 어디 찍어레스 어디 때문에 무슨 징이 됐어
So then the answer to the question is that the reason why it was even brought up that the Madhyamaka and Chittamatra are in harmony or have the same way of practicing serenity is just because there were so many quotes from these Chittamatra texts of Asanga that there was a need to address, that particular school and say, well, is there a difference or not? But actually, it's the same practice for not only all the Buddhist philosophical schools, but even the non-Buddhist practitioners. Again, they're all able to achieve the serenity. So what's the basic practice? It's the same for all of them, going through the 9 stages, making sure that the mind is, able to abide inwardly, that you generate strong, powerful mindfulness and vigilance or meta awareness, and that you are able to overcome those obstacles to abiding single-pointedly on the object, which are the faults of laxity and excitement. And so that you increase the stable abiding aspect of the mind, you increase the vivid, intense clarity of the mind through the practices of the 9 stages of the 9 states that were discussed. The names that are given to those might be different. The names can be different, but the practice is exactly the same. You have to rely on mindfulness and vigilance, and you have to overcome laxity and excitement. That is the practice of developing serenity. So again, here in this particular section of the stages for beings of great capacity, where we're talking about serenity, there were so many quotes from the Chittamatra school that it had to be, that school was particularly addressed in the question, but it's the same. It's a common with all practitioners of who develop serenity. I think a question is in the chat box, so let me read. This is from Richard. You said, so I'll just read exactly. And then I'll try and translate it after. You said, if you ask what is the great vehicle path, on top of the intention to be free, you add the intention to free all. Well, it says human beings, we said sentient beings, but same, which is the aspect of full awakening for the welfare of all sentient beings. Okay, there we go. So the question, so is the bodhicitta motivation to free all beings from suffering, or is it the motivation to lead all beings to complete enlightenment of Buddhahood? Okay, great. I think that's easy enough to ask. Again, la drua dunda enzare Jangchuki sem Takshengi the Jugo Jangchuki sem di Semchen Tamche Dunya le Gilbert de be Kunlong Rebes Dunya le Tro Dunya le Troa de Berebes Yamena Semchen Tamche Zobe Jangchuk to Gobe de Berebes.
다든다 정주 심세들과 심지든지 동안을 전에 치마로 저와 닭이 차고 심지 등이라 줘 등이라 돈이 되니 신이다 동안다 주비 되니 대화 타도 저기 산지 고바딩에 토바 지기 심지 섬도 뒤져라 되고다 그래서 다 정주 심게 발라 인지 친구께 오고 줘거래스 그래서 인지 친구 민남도 있게 영화 야구 맞으나 정주 심게 투여거래스 정주 심이 고랑기 로디기 민남도 어디 가르치나 심지 탐지게 되고 저기 산지 고마와 탐지 친구 고마도 토바 차오 내비고 팀지기 아니 심 팀지기에스 이내 콜라 동네다 전화님 로디 고랑기 몰라디 요 말이스 이내 팀문도 줘거래스 심지 탐지 동네다 전화 치마도 저와든 거라는 게 책임 앞선 남다디 네버 누구도 줘거래스 와다 근데 맹아 뒤에서 누구도 줘거라 어디 지도다디 아니 이제 친구들 동네다 전화 삼 년을 줘거래스 그런 어디 되는 말이스. 너가 전화서 말이 조장 톰나 삼지 와 심지 탐지도 조비 창지 조비 산지 고마 톰나 지마는 선거 뒤로 뒤에서 유전의 뒤니 개발을 해서 뒤슈지.
So, oops. Oh yes, still unmuted. Okay, so this thought or wish or emotion of great compassion, which thinks and has the sense, the felt sense that, you know, how wonderful would it be if all sentient beings were free from suffering? I will free them from their suffering. That's great compassion. That's called compassion, right? So the compassion is actually a precursor. It's something which is a preliminary to bodhicitta. The compassion is not the nature or the essence of bodhicitta itself, but it must go first. And so after you have that great compassion, thinking and feeling, I must free all sentient beings from suffering, then the actual essence or the actual nature of bodhicitta is then the attitude which wishes, for the sake of all sentient beings, I must attain full awakening. So if you think or feel I must attain awakening, that's the actual bodhicitta. So it's important to understand, though, that why we sort of emphasize the compassion aspect, even though it's the cause, is because you can't generate bodhicitta without having compassion, that kind of compassion first. So you have to have an awareness of the aim of that compassion and the sense, the felt sense of that compassion before you generate bodhicitta. But the actual bodhicitta is the aspiration for the attainment of complete and perfect Buddhahood. And this is, again, sort of, it becomes clear when we look at the 7-point cause and effect instruction for generating bodhicitta, where you have great compassion, then you have the altruistic intention, then you have the result, right? Bodhicitta. So it's this compassion, which was mentioned, is not the real essence of bodhicitta, but a cause of it. Any more questions?
I have one question. How does one escape the suffering that arises when all beings
If Venerable Chimpo could please maybe say it again or type it. How does one escape this? Oh, actually, if I don't know if you mind, but there was a follow-up question from the first question, so he just typed it in. So let me ask that first. But since we'll get to the second one, since it's so we don't have a break in the two questions. So again, do a jigen tambo the younger to a chungchung disha the jets kongi the dobo jig sabo chai sumari then Johnson the jig samshin shan core le droid duba roas zojang la gube duba maroas tatun doba di jig sorry sumari
그래서
Johnson the samshin shan core le droid duba rebe samshin shan zojang la gube duba rebe
원래 다 심지어 신 코알을 좋아되와 뒤 말했어. 뒤주고만 해봤지. 등에 타달래. 와 답에 심지어 담지 와 등에 심지어 찍으면 해봤지. 심지어 탐지 장래 심지 심지어 탐지 등에 타다단 쳐봤어. 등에 들어가 와 무문부에 되는 장비 등에 당 CCTV 장비 등에 니는 와 어떤 등에 타다다 전화 지마루 주위 좋아돼 톱나 토비 치도들이 니 도비 정주 도바 지기 어떤 뒷니가래요. 그만이 저주 쌤들한테는 충전을 주고 그만 충전 생중이 해서 심지어 탐지 등에 타다단 주위 대화 담바디 톱나 지마루 뒤치도 아니 뒤 누가 찍지 다 뒤치도들이 얘기 때문에 도비 산지 고마 토바 자기 누가 니와 어떤 뒷니 누가 니 손이 진짜 쌤지라 저주 쌤들에서
So the bodhicitta, sorry, I didn't say the follow-up question in English. So then the first questioner, once again, sort of to get more clarification, asked, so then is it correct to say that bodhicitta is the desire or aspiration to liberate others, but not to turn them into Buddha. So that was his question. So Genla is saying, no, it's not merely to liberate others from samsara. It's, when we say the aspiration for the sake of others to attain awakening, it's to liberate others from all forms of suffering, liberate all sentient beings other than oneself from all forms of suffering. So what does that mean to say all forms of suffering? Well, it refers to this because there is suffering which is brought about by afflictions, but then there's also suffering which is brought about by the obscurations to omniscience, the subtle obscurations. So that's also considered suffering. So it's not just the suffering of samsara. So the suffering brought about by the obscurations to omniscience, if you're liberated from that, then you are a Buddha. Buddha is the only kind of being who's liberated from those kinds of from the sufferings that are brought about by obscurations to omniscience. Now, when we talk about bodhicitta, it's actually something which has a combination of two aspirations. So bodhicitta has a combination of two different aspirations. The first is the aspiration to free all sentient beings from all forms of suffering. So that's one of the aspirations as part of bodhicitta. The other is that in order to do that, I will attain complete awakening myself. So that's the second aspiration. So bodhicitta has a combination of these two aspirations. So the how does one escape the suffering that arises from wanting all beings to escape suffering? Okay, let me think about this. So I'll just state that it might be difficult to get the point across because this would not be considered something that causes suffering, and it might feel, so I'm just wondering, I guess I'll just not just ask the question outright, but sort of say the idea behind it, maybe if that's okay with the questioner, that there's the possible doubt or question, doesn't the desire to free others from suffering itself create suffering? And then and then ask the question after that, if that's if that is okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, so again, na 도바지 레기도 지 삼진 탐제 지 둥어레 더 더버이나 더버데 크랑기 깽기 랑라 둥어지 용기로 와스 제장 랑라 그비 둥어 지 랑라 용웨 둥어디 삼진 셴다 라 둥어레 더 더버기 깽기 게베 둥어디 간데스레 토고레 간데스 둥어디 사고레
그래서 저는 연전을 나가서 좋았습니다.
Samshan Shanda like Ningje, that so that Ningje. Ningje Kena, and he rung la dungo ke yongras. Samshan Shan dungo dung Jonas, Nyambe lo di Krong la dungo chike yongras. Lo dinde Kena. 도파 디레기나.
소소로 두개째 우마래. 가슴에 신진신이 두면나와 토네. 다 두가지 전에 찜마루 삼비로지 깨와라와. 어디 깨연디 아니 소소게 되는 제와데 닭이 채우는 쿨이 채와이나 소소로 두면되는 말. 쿨이 채와되면은 아니 소소로 두면되는 거. 근데 전주 심기지시도 심제든지 두가다 전에 찜마루 좋아진 거라는 게 지금 있으니 로고 친구 휴지긴 로지와. 뒤여디 아로 두면 봐 용신 대화처럼 와. 가슴 동네 공개저와 소소게 되는 대화 탐지시나 파때 신기 두가던 소소 술랭엔들아 소소 셈나 뽑아지 가르쳐서 전주 승기 년명이 승제 통제는 되니까 소소 대화 강화 승진들이라 빨리 땅이 있으니까 상무 야친구 유아인상 진리지기 상무 땅는데 아니 소소라 두뇌시 계전에 대화 하고 필요해. 와 전주 승기 대화디 배 휴지 미스 배워 주고 쓰라고 전주 승기 준비 대화디 배야 휴지 패해 와. 다 뒤로 장마저 나가는 소소 심제든지 동안도 저는 선비로들아 장 년직이 진짜 시작와 있는 딜레이 말이었어. 당연하죠. 파다도 딜레이 용이래 했으면 쌤도 지내고라도 오늘 공개되는 이 용해션에 다른 로고 쳐도 소소 신경이 되는 내 나나더니 배 까발아서 봤네 거네. 니긴 신경이 되는 거랑 소도 있는 왜 땅에 딜레이 선물도 되고 나 자주 쓰면 와 아니 뒤치도 두뇌 용어 봐셔네 배 다른 대화처럼 그래서 자주 쓰 말로 와 강라 누바 제가 된다와 대위 중에들라 찾아 준준나가 자주 세바스인데 그러지었으나 자주 세바는 누바 가주 개와는 팀직이 대화체로 두고 그래서 그런 게 냠내들 하고 배고 와 우선은 뒷난지 전에 선제 담지 동화다 전화 지만 선물로지 끼는데 제와된 거랑 게 지금 선배에 다른 곳이 죄들 뒷난체로 두고 와 대화체로 두고 말도 등에 깨리고 말했어 와 팀 마용한테 다디 냠내 지금 오늘 자주 세바도 지시적 빼잖아 맞대나 하고 와 뭐도 지금 어주기 다이 가서 뭐 땅땅지래 뭐도 하나 저거 막 지시적 빼잖아 맞대나 다른 배 대화체로 두고랬어 준준나라 양양도 송여가 어디 막 주에
Gena Yange Lungdi Chisunda Chinjuki
가
Lungdi.
제와 된다와 대위 중에들라 차선 다 자주 선바들라 자주 선바라 받는 제나 우리신나 코로 사기로 와 미자 박인 표가 전에 코로 사이면도 대화를 하고 빼야 되겠으면 호랑이 냠는 게 삼노지 수선지 남상 배교를 와 표현도 왜 냠는데 폐기도 우선 다른 대화를 하고 빼고 이다도 다 선진시 동아다 대화 돈 동아다 전에 지마로 삼일로 지는데 대화된 거랑 게 지금 무슨 동아들 나도 통나 다른 거랑 게 대화를 하고 빼고 그래서 그런 선진이 된 가지고 주는 대화를 하고 빼는지 그래서 어디 자주 쓴 게 어디 이거
That's a Tichina. So there's no suffering that arises when you have this kind of thought. The suffering won't arise when you have this motivation. So we talk about bodhicitta, and it's this powerful mind that thinks, that feels, I will free all sentient beings from suffering. And what kind of mind is that? It's an extraordinarily courageous mind. So when you are developing that or meditating on that, then you naturally give rise to a great sense of courage. It's because you're not just thinking, may beings be free from suffering, but you're thinking, I will free them from suffering. I will free them from suffering is a mind where you have this kind of, self-confidence. And so you are willing to sacrifice yourself for the sake of others. So no suffering will arise because your mind has been made so broad, your thinking is so broad and vast that you don't experience suffering. Instead, the happiness that you experience is actually an extraordinary kind of happiness, an extraordinary great kind of happiness or bliss. And so this is talked about by Bodhi in the Bodhicharyavatara by Shantideva, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, which, again, I think is still being taught by Genlo Sundarge on Sunday mornings. And so this text has many quotations, many verses that discuss this point. So I don't know the exact quotation, I apologize, but again, let's quoted one verse. The meaning of it is that, so for a bodhisattva, when they are harmed by somebody, instead of getting angry, like ordinarily we would get angry, because of the power of their practice of this compassion and bodhicitta, their happiness grows. They get even happier because they realize, oh, here is an opportunity for my practice to grow even deeper. So this is a condition for my practice to grow even deeper, for my patience to grow even stronger. So they actually become very happy when others harm them. So when we're like hearing about these concepts or these practices, then that kind of idea can arise, right? Like if I wish all beings to be free from suffering, then that's going to kind of be painful for myself or bring some kind of suffering for myself. But when you actually go to meditate in this way and you actually do the practices, then you won't find that that's what happens. You'll find that instead just the happiness grows stronger, which is again what the text state. And so it's again by the power of your practice, because of this vast way of thinking, that your happiness becomes something unlike anything you've had before, but it's an especially happy kind of happiness. Okay, so here we will leave the class for today.
Namda Shin La Cheba Sho Ye Damang Gu Tamduen Gewe Shela Sowa De Changchu Sumcho Rinpo Je Ma Ge Kwa Na Geju Gewa Nyamba Meba Yang Kone Kondu Ewa Sho Gewa Di Gewo Gu Suanama Yishi Zodu Suanama Yishi Le Chungwe Tamba Gun Toba Sho. Oh yeah. I wish you all a good night. Thank you. Geshe.
토체나 길라.
Thank you.
Namo.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.